Hi, folks. I believe this is going to be our last PowerPoint together, and for that, I am sad. However, I did want to prepare something to review some themes in Jewish identity development. Oh my, it's raining Jewish identity clip art. Hallelujah. Well, there you go, to get us started. This PowerPoint is going to be a little bit of a review, and hopefully you will recognize some of the themes that we covered as we go through. Just to a note, I'm going to be talking most or almost entirely about psychological developmental approaches, since this is a psychological developmental class, which means I'm not going to be talking that much about the large socio-demographic studies that say Jews believe this, that, and the other, and Jews um, do this, that, and the other. Those are more descriptive, as it were. As someone who has done some studying of Jewish identity, I can talk firsthand about some of the difficulties involved in studying this. I can tell you firsthand about some of the difficulties involved in studying this area. The first is that there has been a real focus on adolescence as the area of development of identity, and you can kind of get a sense of that from the Erikson reading, even though in our discussions we discussed that all of the Erikson stages, they're not as neatly cut at certain ages as we might think they are. But the idea that one can study identity throughout the lifespan, even with younger kids and even with adults, is something that has evolved over time. In a way, it was there. Everyone knew that there was identity isn't only formed in a short period, but it took some time for the research in, at least in Jewish education, to catch up with that. The second is, of course, perhaps the most complicated here, is that no one knows what it is. There is no it. It's not like studying someone's height, where we all have a general agreement of what the thing is. And essentially, in order to study it, we have to use definitions that we have to use some kind of definition so that we can find the it when we study it. And as we'll talk a little bit about, there's been shifts in how that goes and how those definitions work. It would be much easier to study, if someone's right arm's length is related to their left arm's length, because it's a very specific type of thing to study. Not as useful, though. And the last is that everyone knows what it is. And that makes it a little bit difficult because most people who are involved in not just studying it, but consuming and reading that which is studied, have a certain, they have a horse in the race, as it were. They have opinions, they have ideas, and sometimes it's hard to frame research or to share research in an atmosphere where there is a certain loadedness to how we define, for example, Jewish identity, because not only might we disagree, but you might think my definition will lead to the demise of the Jewish people. That's stating it a little bit hard, but you get the idea that people hold these things very tightly. And it's hard to sometimes have a discussion on research, which requires a little bit of a step back from being in the conversation. We'll start with some general trends and tensions in the field, some things that have happened over the past 20 years or so. The first is that we have about 20, 25 years ago, and beyond, you probably would be looking at identity as measured or understood as external manifestations. How often you did X, Y, and Z, go to synagogue, did you light Shabbat candles, etc., etc. And one of the trends over time has been a move toward understanding identity as more of an internal self-definition. Again, I'm not saying these are good or bad, and they're certainly not universal. That's not the case that we've sort of given up on these external manifestations, but perhaps the trend is that self-definition has taken a more prominent place in the discussion. A second trend is that we've moved from what we might call a pediatric approach or adolescent and to a lesser extent throughout childhood approach to more of a lifespan understanding, that we really had a focus on early life experiences and teaching when they were young and getting kind of front loading a lot of Jewish experiences in order to build a sense of Jewish identity. We've gotten much more into talking about the Jewish identity as something that can be that is a lifespan concept. And one final trend here is a move from seeing identity as somewhat static, of anchored and unyielding, to thinking of things more as a journey. No, not 70s and 80s rock band Journey, famous for songs such as Don't Stop Believin'. Oh no, guys. The journey concept is one that was popularized by the work of Bethany Horowitz, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And the idea is that development is neither set in stone nor linear, and things kind of wax and wane, and if you think about it in that way over time. Okay, stay with me here because this slide's going to be a little complicated. Don't worry, I'll be right here. I'm going to talk a little bit about a schema-based approach to understanding identity in general and Jewish identity in particular. This is actually an approach that I take in some of my work and some of my understanding, and is described in the article that you were assigned. The idea starts with the notion that there's this overall sense of self, a general sense of who I am. And I have some general cognitions, affect, and behaviors, that's cog, aff, be, related to, in general, who I am. And when we say my identity, it's a shorthand for that overall sense of myself. And, this I know about myself. A cognition is how I feel about myself. This is a typical behavior of myself. But another trend, and I guess I could have noted this in trends, but so be it, is that we often, or we generally, or at least I generally, don't talk about a self, we might talk about a self, but we may not talk about, or I don't talk about, an identity. That we have these different sub-identities, sub-selves, whatever we want to call it, that we have, again, each related to cognition, affect, and behavior. What do I know about myself as a Jew? What do I know about Judaism? How do I feel about myself as a Jew? What do I feel about Judaism related to that? What are behaviors, including, by the way, the behavior here includes social and communal behaviors. So it's a very broad topic. It isn't just lighting candles, but it has to do with also, peer groups and such. And affect is not just feelings about it, but beliefs and attitudes, which to me fall somewhere between cognition and affect. And my different subselves here are related to different experiences and roles and relationships out in the world. And here you see, as an example, Shabbat is something in the world, again, something about which I have some knowledge, some beliefs, some attitudes, some behaviors, and I see it related to who I am as a Jew, and my attitudes, knowledge, and behaviors relate to who I am as a Jew. It's fairly obvious type of intersection that that what I know, feel, and do about Shabbat is related to who I am as a Jew. And I could have, if I had a really big PowerPoint, put any number of different things in the world, roles, relationships, experiences that relate to me as a Jew. I'm putting up another sub-self or another sub-identity here. And here I put up me as father, which is, this is actually somewhat autobiographical here. And there are things I do, things I believe about myself as a father, things, attitudes, belief, emotions related to that. Now, generally speaking, in healthy people with kind of healthy psychological makeup, our overall self does not exist in as a bunch of disconnected sub-selves or me as. There are, here we go, wait, there are some connections between them. That there is some overlap. If I was really fancy, I'd make the circles go and overlap with each other. There is some overlap between the cognition, affects, and behavior related to me as a father and those of me and a Jew. So just for example, I have various attitudes and opinions and behaviors about how my kids should, what they should do when they go to shul, to synagogue and Shabbat. Do they stay in the service? They not stay in the service? What kind of behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And here you start seeing what we might call an identity, a self-system, an identity system, rather than just kind of a loose conglomeration of different identity aspects. And again, you can start seeing that certain activities like Shabbat are also related to me as a father. And again, some of these would be overlapping. I drew dashed lines not to indicate strength here, but just so you can kind of keep track of them. That Shabbat has some relation in terms of, again, ecologically, in terms of impacting and being impacted by me as a father. So the way I interact, the me as Jew in relation to Shabbat was very different before I had kids. I had kids, and that is almost like one of those ecological maps that you drew. It connects up in different ways, and now Shabbat is related to both aspects of me. All right, I've now entered another self category or sub-self or an identity, a sub-identity, a me as. And this is me as an athlete. And there are a couple of things that you may or may not know about me. The first is that I'm not particularly athletic and never have been really, except for the fact that about 7 years ago, actually about 7 years ago to the day today, I ran a marathon to support a charity, and have done so twice more. So this is, and I've sort of gotten into running, although I don't do it as often as I used to, and I do have some cognitions, some affect, and some behavior related to a sense of myself as an athlete. Now, I don't have a lot of behaviors related to me as an athlete. I don't have a lot of behaviors that I do. I don't have a lot of relationships. I don't have a lot of roles based on me as an athlete. And how I've drawn it here is actually somewhat meaningful. I connected it to myself through a weaker line, so this is supposed to be a little weaker. And I also kind of kicked it out over there in the upper corner. And that what I'm trying to show graphically here is that that piece of me as an athlete, and you could also see that the circles are smaller. Everything there is smaller because the sense of me as an athlete doesn't have a lot of characteristics associated. There's not much I know related to me as an athlete, not much I feel about it. I don't have a lot of relations. While I was training for my first marathon, it was bigger, maybe that circle, and maybe a little more connected because people would talk to me about it, and I would, join up with other runners and that kind of thing. But now, it's not really a central part of who I am. That me as athlete, look, it's in my self system, but it's largely disconnected from the rest of it. So if I wanted to describe all of these things through the roles and relationships associated with them, I have roles and relationships related to me as a Jew, me as a father. Again, those intersect actually quite a bit. I'm friendly with I'm friendly with the kids, the parents of kids, and I see them in synagogue, and I like going to synagogue because I get to see some of them. So there's that connection. And their Shabbat also interconnected, and I have roles and relationships related to Shabbat. And then me as an athlete is a less central part of things, as I don't have many roles and relationships. And this approach is, in a way, it is maybe an experiential approach in that it takes these roles and relationships as important factors that help these me-ases, the sub-selves or the sub-identities, identity aspects, maybe we'll call them. The roles and relationships both impact those and are impacted by those. And the more roles and relationships that you have related to yourselves or related to the intersecting things in the world, like Shabbat, the more roles and relationships you have, you will likely develop more thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and behaviors about that part of yourself, and which in turn would probably lead to more roles and relationships. Now, I started that, this is a chicken egg thing. Where that cycle starts is, somewhat arbitrary. So back to me as an athlete, there's not that much going on there. It's not a central part of who I am, so I don't really pursue roles and relationships, and therefore it doesn't then feed back to who I am, and that cycle doesn't happen in the same way. There are just a couple of further terms about these selves. The first is that different parts of oneself, these self aspects, me as Jew, me as father, they have a particular, they can be described with a particular valence. Are they positive, or do I have positive feelings about them in general, or negative feelings about them in general, or sort of neutral, as I said about the athlete thing. We could also talk about the self as more or less elaborate. And by elaborate, that means that there are the more an elaborate identity structure has more of these selves, more of the me-ases, and more cognitions, affect, behaviors, roles, relationships associated with those. So, and because there are more roles and relationships, you would see more of the things in the world. Like it wouldn't just be the Shabbat circle. There would be lots of other, things in the world, both Jewish and not, that would be there for an elaborated self. Now, I don't see elaboration as a particular value judgment, and I as a in that, well, to some extent there is, but I think you could have too little and both too little elaboration and too much elaboration, in that if you really don't have a lot of oh, let me just explain complexity first, which is the number of interconnections. So the me as father, me as Jew connected. Um, that would be, yes to complexity. The me as athlete doesn't really contribute to complexity because it's an outlier out there. So now let me get back to the too much, too little. I think you could have too much elaboration and complexity and too little, and the too little is somewhat easier to see in that you don't have kind of a synergy within who you are. So without the complexity, for example, I do this as a Jew, and then I turn it off, and then I have this as a father, and I don't really see my world as connected in that way. Or, I do this and I do that, but there are a lot of things I go through my life where I don't really see as part of who I am, because I haven't really developed an identity around that. And the interconnections, again, to the extent to which you see a sort of whole to your life, that there's things that you do in one domain of yourself are related in some way to things you do as another, could be useful. And there's actually some research around this that if you if you have sorry, let me just say the other part. The other part is that you could also have, I think, too many of these connections, and you could have a self that is kind of really tight, so that me as a Jew completely overlaps with me as a father, and I think that there are some dangers to that too. And let me get back to the research that shows that if there is some kind of problem associated with one of the selves, then how big an impact that has on your overall sense of self is in part determined by the elaboration and complexity of the self system. So I don't have my job up here. I don't have me as researcher. So let's say I put me as researcher up there, and I have that, and I have 10 other me ases up there, and all of them are really important, and all of them are fairly well connected, and I lose my job. It's going to impact greatly. It changes my ecological system enormously, but it may not change my self-structure if we've got a lot of other selves, and if the connection between work and other selves was, somewhat moderate. You don't want to completely disconnect it. But if I don't have a lot of selves, or if work self takes up a huge amount of space in my self system, or if it is completely linked in this system to other selves, if that one is impacted upon, it kind of brings the system down with it. So there's sort of a medium amount of complexity and elaboration that seems to work. Now, of course, there's no such thing as these things. We can't count them. We could ask people to tell us about it. Would give us some indication of what they're thinking. But in the end, what it comes down to is a system of interconnected ideas about different selves, different me-ases, different aspects of myself, cognitions, affect, behavior related to those, that are determined and vice versa, and by roles and relationships and experiences out in the world. I'm going to speak a little bit more concretely about some of the research that's out there. Elkind, you read earlier on the Piagetian approach. He's the one who asked, can a dog be Jewish and that kind of thing. You got increased abstraction over time, but keep in mind that part of the story is not a linear growth pattern, but rather that different people are moving at different rates in different times. Here you have a few of the results, and there's interesting trends by third and fourth grade and sixth and seventh grade. Both of them believe God is everywhere as a top. The third and fourth graders have this notion of punishment, kind of also front in their mind. In the sixth and seventh grades, these are from a list of possible beliefs, and they ask them to endorse that. And in sixth and seventh grade, you get this interesting idea. You still get this idea that God reacts when something is wrong, but it moves from a more concrete punishment to more of an emotional belief. And you also get this abstract idea that you could talk to God. Now you might say, well, that's concrete, because it's actually talking to a deity, but I do think that there's some level of abstraction there, and that you could interact with something that is not kind of corporeal, doesn't have a body in that way. You could also see it developmentally, perhaps as so in that way, you're kind of moving from a more concrete to a more abstract. You might also see it in terms of the younger kids being still in the kind of inferiority versus industry, or vice versa. That they're kind of worried about doing the wrong thing. And six and seven, that's still in their mind, but you start also getting into the kind of discovery of self within relationships that adolescents, here you're in kind of pre-adolescence, so it could be a relevant trend there as well. And just briefly, a disturbing trend, because it's disturbing, depends on how you look at it. And again, I don't know if these are still hold, these aren't the newest of data, but you could see that quite a number of people, a number of these kids don't talk about to their parents or God. And I guess the encouraging news here is that teachers were, these are supplemental school teachers, were commonly in conversation with the kids about God. Just a word about the Arno reading. It was fairly straightforward, but I do want to point out that it touches on a bunch of things that we talked about in class. So let me use the time for review. The first is obviously the kind of psychoanalytic area of early experiences and their importance. He talks about the importance of Jewish competence in which again has to do with, we talked about the ABCs, the autonomy, belonging, and competence as some basic motivating drives. Again, we talked about that way back in the psychodynamic area. And we also talked about the social learning theory of self-efficacy, where it's kind of perceived ability to do what you need to do is motivating, and lack of that is unmotivating or distancing, something that Arno talks about as well. And the finally is functional. He describes the Jewish community as a resource, and kind of what are you getting from that relationship that then builds connection, which then builds more resources, which then builds connection, which you kind of see it from an ecological point of view in terms of the connection of person and setting. You may even see it from a kind of behavioral operant conditioning point of view, that there are certain rewards you get for engaging in Jewish work. I'm not talking about here's a cookie, but I'm talking, if you go to synagogue, but I'm talking about you might see that there's some advice that you get from friends during Kiddush or something like that, or the sense of spiritual rest that you get for a little bit. And there are resources, different resources. It's not all synagogue. Those were some examples. We talked about ecology not that long ago, or just a couple weeks ago. So this should ring a bell. What are the Jewish roles played, and in what context are they played? So um, where does Jewish happen? The context of their school context, their camp context, peer context, and then within those contexts, what Jewish roles do you have? So, just because you go to Jewish summer camp doesn't mean everyone in the summer camp has the same array of Jewish roles that they play there, and it's a really individualized look, like you did in your ecology map assignment. It's a very individualized set of experiences that kids have, even when they're in the same kind of context. And the other is, what are the bridges between the contexts, those mesosystems, both cross-sectionally and longitudinally. A bunch of you pointed that out in your ecological maps when you talked about disconnects between a family and a school, or a camp and the camp experience and the synagogue experience. And it is something that we've, I think, started to deal with more as a community. We have Ramah programs that are running in communities to bring some of the Ramah spirit to the community. We have first and second grade programs in synagogue schools and day schools working with early childhood programs to try to ease so the parents don't pull their kid out after early childhood and then kind of bring them back in fourth grade when they're starting to think about B'nai Mitzvah. So again, bridges in Jewish context, cross-sectionally and over time. Just to mention briefly that there is an emerging field of neurotheology, and yes, that is a thing. And it's interesting reading. It's not really developed enough as a field to talk about developmental trends there, but there is kind of talk of, for example, an area in the brain, the part of the parietal lobe, that when it's stimulated gives you a feeling of kind of at one with the world, the transcendent connection. So there's some thought maybe that has to do with the sense of spirituality. Just a quick note about the work of Bethany Horowitz, who is a researcher now working at NYU, and had a very well-known project called Connections and Journeys that is now about 20 years old or so, and really in some way changed the way people talk about Jewish identity. It was a very impactful study. And essentially she did interviews and surveys and had a number of different findings, but most relevant here is that there were three kind of overall modes of that she classified. Low involvement, we call it low, middle, and high involvement, and there's a lot more detail there. But the second bullet point here is that overall it's not a vast majority, but the majority showed some change in their mode over time. And she really started to popularize the idea of, like we said in an earlier slide, that things are not static, that people go in and out of a certain mode over time. Just developmentally, she found that the predictors of high involvement for the Orthodox were early experiences, and for the non-Orthodox were voluntary experiences, such as camps or social action type of things. Another key publication within the past couple of decades is Cohen and Eisen's The Jew Within, which I believe is year 2000. Stephen Cohen and Chancellor Eisen, before he was Chancellor Eisen. And the big takeaway, there were lots of different findings there, but the big takeaway was what they considered to be a privatization of Judaism, whereas in past generations you've got people identified their Jewishness with an organization, or I'm a member of this congregation, or I go to the JCC, or whatever it is. We've kind of shifted over time to something that's much more personal and individualistic and non-committal, because the personal meaning on an individual basis changes over time. Non-committal also because people's connection to organizations have decreased as part. That was one of the findings as well. People don't feel connected to organizations and feel that their Judaism is just that. Their Judaism is their Judaism, and even that expression, "my Judaism," is something that it might not have. I don't know if it wouldn't have been heard, but it might not have had the same kind of meaning in times where Judaism, where people reacted to Judaism in a more communal sense. And finally, even though I said I wasn't really going to talk about, I wasn't going to talk about socio-demographic studies. How can you do a PowerPoint about Jewish identity without talking about the Pews study that came out a couple of years ago? And I'm sure that you have encountered the discussions about different elements of this. I'm including it here because of its relation to some thinking about identity. So in Cohen and Eisen, the turn was inward, and the real conversation that was based on that is, how is one defining Judaism? One of that is relevant to the concept of identity is this issue of the emergence of the nones, Jews of people who identify themselves as Jewish, but who say they are atheist, agnostic, or have no religion. On the one hand, you could say, well, it's just a cut and dried area of people who are defining themselves out of the religion. But on the other hand, and raising interesting questions in terms of identity, are some of the findings that, of these Jews of no religion, sure, fewer percentage or lower percentage say they're proud than Jews with religion, say that they're proud to be Jewish. 83 of these Jews of no religion are proud to be Jewish. So from or again, though the number is much less, you've got, just looking at the data here, 42% of the Jews of no religion said they have a strong sense of belonging to the Jewish people. And there are a bunch of different findings like that. Now, the numbers for the nones aren't up there with the numbers of the not nones. However, it does raise this interesting identity question of, yes, we talked about Judaism turning inward and being self-identification. We talked about that with the Jew within. So what is it? How are people constructing Judaism now? What does it mean for someone to say they are Jewish? Kind of a psychological level. How do they put together those identity pieces, the self as Jew, in a way that they define it as something they're proud of and something they're connected to other people who are like them, but not as a religion. And similarly, the numbers of engaged, and you have to look at the survey to take a look at what engaged means, but is down. But those who are engaged are even more engaged. And this, I haven't seen this discussed in the data, but again, it kind of gets me wondering about how the Jew within data, which is a kind of an internally movement of Judaism, is being held up against this idea of increased communal engagement. And if you, the trend now is for organizational affiliation. Now, what they call the legacy organizations, the long-standing Jewish community centers, synagogues, may not be where people are doing it, but kind of more recent organizations, and you could point to any number of these. You could point to Hazon, you could point to Hadar, or whatever it may be, do seem to be and consistent with the data, is that there are engaged people who are very much want to be a part of these kind of communities. You could make the argument that the communities are a little less; those communities are a bit more porous. You don't have to join Chazon and go there and kind of show up all the time. You could show up some of the time and still be a part of that, but it does raise this question of how engagement is now playing out, and how that compares to the kind of inward turn that we saw in Jew Within, and whether that inward turn was to try to seek something that organizations weren't giving, and that these kind of newer organizations might be providing that, whatever it may be, a spiritual sense, a sense of connection, and therefore perhaps people are turning more outward again. These are questions, hard to say. All right, last slide of the last PowerPoint. So adios, goodbye.